morning, everybody. And unfortunately, I can't see you right now, but welcome. So today we're going to talk to you about Pbis implementation in rural settings. And my name is Heather George, and I'm here with my esteemed colleagues from various universities who are going to be talking to you about what we've learned, lessons learned about implementation of Pbis in rural settings. And we've got some great case examples of what it's looked like in a state of scaling up at a wide scale, and then also what types of adaptations needed to be done within a classroom setting. The whole goal today is that we would like to make sure that you can learn a little bit more about Pbis in rural implementation. We only have an hour today. So how we would like to set this up is because there's 4 presenters that are going to be presenting to you as we're transitioning over and sharing our screens with you. This is a great opportunity during those times to ask questions in the chat box. We'll be able to see those as they're coming in, and we'll be answering them throughout that hour time that we have together. So let's see. The other thing, too, is that we've got 2 sets of handouts that are going to be uploaded onto the national site. They should be up there probably within a little bit on that national site. But one is the full slides for you, because some folks like to just see it all on one slide if there's a lot of print on there. And the other is 6 slides per page. The other thing is that when you do post something in the chat box, I just want to be able to remind you, please post where you're from. You don't have to go into great detail, but it could be that you want to say that you're from a particular district or say from your state, and then what your current position is. So let's get started on this. If you could go ahead and post what your current position is and where you're from, we would love to see who's online with us live right now. And while you're posting that, I'm going to go ahead and continue on discussing. So also want to give you guys a heads up. We are recording this, and it will be posted online within the next 3 weeks. And again, as a reminder, this is a great opportunity because you are participating live to ask questions for us. So even if somebody else is presenting and you may have a question for the previous person that had just presented, please put that in the chat box, and we'll be making sure to mind that and answer those questions as we're going. So essentially today we're going to talk about just kind of that quick background, making sure that we're all on the same page of what it means to be for Pbis. What does that mean for implementation? Because as we transition and understand the strengths and some of the barriers that rural settings face, helping you understand what kinds of adaptations we can do within these unique settings. And then learning directly from some examples. And I think this is a great opportunity to hear from Karen and Janet based upon what they have done in rural settings. And then we're also going to help you become familiar with some of the resources that we do have available on the national site that are free, that you can go directly to as we've provided those links. So to just get started, and I'm just going to give a quick overview to you guys before I turn it over to Laura. I want you guys to think about, you've probably seen these 3 circles before. And so when we're thinking about what are our outcomes, so if you're coming in from a school, you're coming in from a district, or if you're state level and you have several rural LEAs that you're supporting, you have to think about what are the outcomes that we're wanting to achieve. And based upon these outcomes, how do we make sure that everybody is having equitable access to all of the resources, whether it's students are having equitable access to great curriculum and opportunities within that school, schools are having equitable access to resources available within their district. And we use our data in that process to help us determine where are our needs, but where are we also doing well. It might force us then to examine our practices in this piece and adjust our system so that we can best support these changes so that we do have a greater likelihood of achieving our outcomes. I think one thing that's important to know is we know being in a rural setting, sometimes you can feel isolated, and do people remember that we're out here wherever we are? And so to know that there's always a connection in this process. So whatever state that you're located, to just know that there is that district component. And even if you're a rural school and you are the LEA and feeling out there, just knowing that there is this connection of how can you connect with other rural schools around, but to know that as that district piece, there's this intersection of what we're doing to support the school, but then what we put into place at the school has a direct impact, and hopefully positive, in that classroom, so that we have the greatest opportunity to positively impact the student in that classroom. And overall, our goal is to create these positive, predictable, safe learning environments, regardless of where we're located. And how we're going to do that is we've got to connect with each other. We've got to build our relationships with folks. We've got to be able to use our data, screen to see who needs support. It's not just an issue of which kids need supports, but also there's teachers, there's adults that need supports as well. Providing those supports and going in and teaching, whether it's new skills that we need for the adults or whether it's the specific skills for the kids, but we want everybody to be successful so that it's a win-win situation for all. And then using our data to monitor as we're going, which is essentially that problem-solving process. And the way in which we start to organize things is around that team. So again, that team needs to exist at that school level, but there may be teams at a district level and teams at the state level as well. And those teams are looking at who are our stakeholders. So if you're a school, that stakeholder would be your kids. It's going to be the other colleagues, the teachers at your school. It's going to be the administrator. It's going to be your families. And it could be your community businesses, your partners as well. And we've got to think about, how can we work smarter on our campus if we are bringing in positive supports and trying to prevent problem behavior? What types of adjustments might we need to make in our policies to make sure that they're not accidentally contradicting what we're trying to set in place within our school system? And then what types of skills and building the skills of our workforce capacity across the board? And that helps us determine then what trainings, what additional coaching and supports we might need, as well as then the types of data that we have access to make sure that we are making those quick decisions so that we can be most effective. So thinking about the Pbis framework, I want you to think about it as the lava lamp. So, our goal is to build these positive school environments to increase overall school safety. We want to improve the academic, the social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes for all students and adults as well. And we also want to make sure that we are preventing as much and reducing problem behavior by using this team-based approach, using our data in this process to make decisions. We don't want to be guessing. And then we're making sure to build and teach and reinforce when we see students and adults use these new skills. And we're doing this through this multi-tiered support. So if you ever wondered what that multi-tiered support is, just think of that lava lamp. We know we go up and down that lava lamp. And so if you're a person in the blue category moving up and down, there's times you need more supports. And then other times you don't need as much supports. And our kids are the same exact way, and our teachers are the same exact way. Nobody's exempt in this regard. And that's that piece to think about, is that as we're building this support around the students and making sure, what can we provide for all, who needs a little bit more additional supports, we've also got to think about how we're also building the system for adults as well, because we've got to take care of the adults in order for them to be able to take care of the students. And the piece that I want is, you guys have known, and that we found in the research over the last 10 to 20 years, is that we know if we implement Pbis with fidelity, we do see positive results. And the types of results that are based in the research is we're seeing improved student outcomes, there's reduced exclusionary discipline, and there's improved teacher outcomes. So like I said, there's a win-win for everybody. It's not just about the kids only, but the adults benefit as well, the families benefit as well. But we have to make sure that we are implementing as the framework was intended. So how do you build your continuum of support? When you guys are listening to the examples today, I want you to think about whether it's you're coming as a teacher, I want you to think about your entire classroom. If you're a principal, I want you to think about your entire school. And if you are coming from that district level, maybe think about all of your schools across the board. But think about, what is it that everybody needs? So when we're thinking of building this continuum of support, we're looking at that tier 1 is what does everybody need? So this is your core instruction across the board, but it's also your core support process too when you're looking at the adults that are supporting the kids across your school campus or your district. Then what do some need? And then we might refer to this as the tier 2 process, targeted or supplemental supports. But for those that are not responding well to what we're putting into place at that core, that universal level, what additional types of supports might we need? And what types of data are going to help us in determining that they do need a little bit more? And then what do few need? This would be that tier 3, that most intensive or individualized intervention. So you could be looking at, you may have some students that are not, there's a few students not really picking up on the curriculum that you've got with reading. So what additional intensive supports do we need to provide to these students to help them build these specific skills so that they can be successful in what we're providing at that core overall? But again, you could think about as an administrator, what is it that a few of your classrooms are really struggling with so that you can go in and best support your teachers in that regard? So it's always somewhat of a balance of saying, okay, individual person like student versus individual like systems like classrooms or multiple schools. But you can fill in the blank with whatever makes most sense to you. But again, that tiered process, that thinking, what do all need, what do some need, what do few need? And to give you a heads up, we've got, this is just our data from August of 2020, but you can see we've got over 29,000 schools that have reported into our national database. They're saying that they are actively implementing PBIS. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are implementing with fidelity, but it means that they are saying we are doing our best to work towards implementing with fidelity. That's 29,000 schools. That's over 25% of our nation's schools are actively reporting that they are implementing. And I do believe that that is a conservative number, as not everybody reports their numbers to the national database. And we can see this trajectory that's increasing across the board, but let's look just at rural settings. So for you guys, if we just look at the past 3 years from 2014 through 2017, we're seeing there's at least 100 new rural schools from rural settings that are starting to report into our national database. So that is an upward trend as well. And of those 3 years that I'm showing you of this increase, you can see that across the board, if you are the darkest green state, that has the most rural schools that are reporting into the national database. I will say as a disclaimer, being from Florida, that Florida would be dark green, but those numbers were not in the national database at this time. So just letting you know. But we have rural settings in all places across the country. And so we've got lots of lessons that we've learned from all of this. And we are still learning and learning from you as we're going. But as you can see, PBIS is definitely moving on that scale of social importance, and not just all schools, but specifically also for rural settings. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura now and talk to you about what we mean by rural and what we've initially learned so far.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for everybody joining. And it looks like we have a lot of people who are participating who actually kind of know some of this stuff and probably could teach it to us better than we could share with you. So keep that in mind as we're going through. We're learning as we're going along. So overall, and many of you understand this, and this is something we had to understand as a center, is that this concept of what is rural, there's ideas of what that is. Is it farms? Is it lower economic growth areas, stronger communities, country music? There are so many ideas of what rural is that don't necessarily represent all of the diverse cultures and areas that go into that idea of what is rural. It's multifaceted concept, which there is no universal agreement. So that can impact how resources are allocated, the needs of a location, the ability to compare across research when we just say everything is rural, and across studies. And something that we think that PBIS could help to address because of the framework and looking at the needs of the location, that we can kind of address some of this rural being very diverse. Next slide. So there are so many strengths, and these are just two of them that we're highlighting. But some of what we found was that families might prefer smaller schools that foster that sense of local community, and that this is often found in rural settings. And then also that schools all across the country, but really in rural settings, that they're intertwined with how we define our local culture. We think about our athletic teams, and maybe the community comes together to watch basketball games or something like that. That is something that is happening often in these rural areas and is a really positive strength for the areas. We also have been working and trying to not just look at what the research says, but also what do our district and school leaders that are implementing PBIS, what do they say? So we've been going and interviewing some of model exemplars that are doing rural implementation. And we're going to scatter some of this throughout this webinar. We asked them, what are some of the strengths that you're finding when you're implementing PBIS in rural settings? And some of these were really awesome, and we're excited to learn about them. So teachers know their students. We can build great relationships with our students, which we think is so foundational to everything that we're doing. Community oriented. They can work with faith organizations and have access to local vendors. For example, one of our leaders said that there is a local church that's within walking distance from the school that provides after-school programs. And they were thinking of ways that they can work with what's going on in PBIS in their school with what's going on in the after-school program to sort of coordinate that way that we're looking at the social emotional behavior needs of the community. They had extremely supportive administrators that really bought into PBIS. And then it was also embedded in everything they did, in the logos, in the branding, in the sports, that it helped to promote that community spirit that was already a strength of the community. It's easier to get everyone on the same page. PBIS implementation is easier and takes stronger in a small district, as one of our persons we interviewed shared. We also have this barriers that we really want to acknowledge. And some of this might be something that you guys would identify with, and some are that it's just kind of what we're finding in the research. There could be a lack of qualified personnel to meet some of the needs. So you might not have mental health specialists or have less special educators or teachers in general. We're finding a shortage of highly qualified teachers, or just teachers, new teachers, and then keeping them and retaining them. Not enough resources. Often we use our taxes to be able to get resources, and because there might be a reduced tax base, that puts additional strain on some of the communities. For example, a preschool that was doing really great PBIS wanted to have screening, but they didn't have funding to bring that into their setting. There might be less opportunities for professional development, and kind of have to get more creative in how we're going to offer that professional development. And then finally, a large geographical area, which could impact how can families come in for parent nights, or how can we get the kids to school? Maybe our buses are a big part of some of our behavioral needs within the school. So again, these leaders shared some of the barriers that they didn't have district buy-in. And that was a problem for them because they were feeling isolated as one school in a rural area. PBIS was not a priority, especially during COVID. One of the persons had suggested that we're going to have to revamp once we get back into school because there's so much going on. There was a need for more resources, funding, substitute teachers that allowed them to have planning time. And then again, just planning time for those teachers. And then as the teachers were doing so many things across the school and were asked to be taking on a little bit more, that they would like to have some sort of stipends or recognition of that they were taking on a little bit additional for the PBIS. And then finally, a struggle to recognize students at some of the best practices. For example, this was a high praise ratio that we want to have more praise to reprimands, but that was really hard for them to do. And they were struggling with how to do those best practices. This is something that's a misconception we see all across the country on what PBIS is. And as Heather described, that framework and all of the things, the systems of practices to get those good outcomes and looking at the data, this is often a misconception that it's just kind of like a buck token reward system. And this is something that one of them had directly shared. They will use bucks to buy candy, but there's so much more that PBIS should be about, and it's not. So we do think that PBIS could address some of these barriers and really acknowledge some of the strengths, that it can help pull those resources together, like Heather had suggested, and looking at it comprehensively, that instead of having that broken bicycle, we have a full bicycle that's functioning and really gets us the better outcomes. That we can use PBIS to train local capacity, that maybe we might have some external trainers come in, but the goal is to train PBIS teams and coaches within the schools that can help build that local implementation. It could serve as a de facto mental health system, because sometimes we struggle with having those resources, and PBIS can help provide those social, emotional, behavioral needs of the school. And finally, PBIS really stresses this regular use of data, and we have found that that's critical for making sure that we have sustainability when we used our data to make decisions and to meet our valued outcomes, which is also very important for rural schools, given all the competing priorities that they're trying to do at the same time. And we also have found that we're starting to do this initial research of that we're really are having some positive rural outcomes, that teachers of high needs schools that were in rural settings have rated PBIS more positively compared to urban schools, that PBIS schools in rural settings are less likely to abandon PBIS once they get started, 13 times more likely in the city schools. And we have some really good positive outcomes. We're having less suspensions, reduced tardies, and we're really starting to dig even deeper into what do those outcomes look like in the research. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Karen, who's going to provide us some really incredible information of what she's been doing in Maine across the cohort.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Hi, my name's Karen Robbie. I'm from Maine, and back in 2017, the Maine Department of Ed offered a grant opportunity focused on the efficient delivery of educational services. The University of Maine partnered up with a local school district, RSU3, to serve as a lead and a fiscal agent. We borrowed that our cohort training logic from our colleagues at the Northeast Pbis, and the Maine Pbis Regional Professional Development Cohort was born. Like many other areas, Maine is mostly rural and quite large, but not highly populated. This makes our schools really spread out. Even schools within the same district can sometimes be 45-minute drive apart from one another. And as Laura had addressed earlier, access to things like training and technical support for PBIS was really limited. Additionally, many of the rural schools in Maine wanted to learn more about implementing PBIS, but they were unable to adequately fund the training and coaching needed to develop that high-quality, sustainable implementation. So we created a cohort of 15 schools spanning about 5,000 square miles, with student populations ranging anywhere from 60 to 1,000 in each building, and a variety of grade level spans and district structures to participate in a 3-year-long training and implementation project focused on building the Pbis framework within their schools. We have 4 primary objectives for the project. The first was to provide intensive Tier 1 school-wide PBIS training to a cohort of schools. The second was to build a regional PBIS technical assistance network. Third was to increase school and district level capacity for school-wide and class-wide PBIS. And fourth was to establish a Maine-based PBIS website to serve as an anchor for ongoing communication and information. This was completed, so be sure to check us out at mainepbis.org. We're pretty proud of that website. Now let's talk a little bit about how we built capacity, both within the regional cohort and the schools themselves. Just like we strive to do with students in schools implementing PBIS, we begin with clear, explicit, and transparent agreements to serve as the expectations for participation in the project. Then we provided teaching, a structured, a gradual release of responsibility, and a shared roadmap of how to move through implementation. You'll also see here on this slide an example of a participant's quote that had been gathered from evaluations throughout our project. You'll see them periodically just to give you some insight into what their experience was. Before school joined the cohort, we provided agreements to be signed by the trainers, the district and school level administrators, and the individuals who would be serving as school-based PBIS coaches. Copies were then provided to all the parties so that when that inevitable time comes where other priorities started to creep in, all stakeholders had agreements to support requests for time, allocation, funds, and other resources. Then if you were to look really closely, you would see that we as trainers agreed to provide training and technical support to each school for 3 years. But each school also had to commit to PBIS being a top priority for the school, administrator support, including attendance at all the training events, protected time for team meetings and sharing with staff, as well as some minor financial investment, including things like paying for substitutes, sending team members to the main PBIS conference for 5 years, and SWIS, School-Wide Information Systems software program, in year 3 of the project. This type of financial investment is an example of the intentionality of our training design, because as we all know, wherever the money flows is where priority goes, and we wanted to promote that process. As we developed our training model, we were also really intentional about the level of support and training provided to our teams. We basically wanted to work ourselves out of jobs so that we were building internal capacity. Throughout the entire 3-year project, school teams received technical assistance and coaching support from one of us as trainers. However, that level of support was consistently faded back so that teams could gain independence. We began prior to the first year with initial meetings at each school with the entire staff, letting them know what to expect and to reaffirm their commitment. We also held a cohort-wide meeting for district-level administrators over the summer, focused on their role, the expectations of the project, and how they could provide support. And then we began our training blocks. Each training block consisted of a coach meeting with all the coaches from the 15 schools coming together to prepare for the team trainings that would be held the following week. This also provided opportunities for troubleshooting and in-depth understanding of the Pbis framework. In year 1, our team trainings were held for 2 consecutive days in a large space where all 15 school teams could gather to learn and action plan and network. And that occurred 3 times in that first year. To foster their connection to the broader statewide network, school teams were expected to attend the statewide PBIS conference each year. Year 2 repeated the same process. However, instead of 2 consecutive days, it was reduced to 1 day each block. And then year 3 was further reduced as teams were expected to come together only once. Just like the rest of the world, however, COVID hit in March of year 2, so we had to adjust, but we've just moved everything online, and we seem to be continuing forward. But regardless, what happened was that we had this carefully constructed approach supporting a gradual release of responsibility so that the responsibility of the work has really shifted from trainers to the school-based PBIS teams. Yeah, borrowed from our colleagues at Northeast PBIS Network, we provided lots of training and facilitated action planning around these 10 getting started steps. We also supported our teams by giving them an action plan template with these steps embedded into it to serve as a structured roadmap, just to help them get started. But then they decided how to match the core features to their school context. What we heard from them was that they really appreciated this guided support, and it helped to take away some of those common feelings of not knowing where to begin. We wanted to extend the high level of engagement and enthusiasm, the momentum that participants were experiencing during the PD days throughout the interval in between trainings. We accomplished that by having each team establish clear and explicit goals, by building in accountability, and lastly, by providing monthly PBIS prompt newsletters. So between the training blocks, teams were assigned implementation homework. They left training days with identified goals, with addressed doable tasks to produce meaningful outcomes. Here you can see a couple of examples under the things we asked them to think about under the developed part of the slide. And then we also asked them to explore and think about some upcoming areas of implementation. Goals like these were really critical to maintaining momentum because they led to really tangible outcomes and represented real progress. But what we really loved was that they had to come back and do some show and tell at each training, where they shared either a product, a lesson learned, or some type of an outcome measure. Sometimes these were done in small groups and sometimes to the whole group. And it fostered not only a sharing community, but also a sense of accountability for forward progress. Here you can see our monthly a sample of our monthly newsletter, the PBIS prompt that was emailed to all participants, district level administrators, and state representatives. And its purpose was to maintain momentum and cadence for the ongoing work, disseminate new and timely PBIS related information, share practices across schools, and provide acknowledgement for progress that the cohort and schools were making. More importantly, however, it also served as a way for us to model the communication loops that we were encouraging our school teams to develop within the schools. Our preparation for this cohort included planning for sustainability right from the start. We were thoughtful in our design for that gradual release of responsibility. However, the schools taught us a lot about the valuable features of sustainability that were important to them, including building community, networking, sharing, and celebrating success. And they were really honest in their feedback through session evaluations, coach discussions, and even follow-up emails. They wanted more opportunities to learn from one another, to see exemplars from other schools, and hear how different schools were implementing. We believe that, especially due to their really rural nature and often isolated nature, they had really few opportunities to engage with other educators but beyond their individual school community, and that they just could not get enough of it. So we balanced our training days with new content, team time, and school-to-school learning time. And moved from a sit and get type of professional development to really active opportunities to respond and active engagement. We had chosen topics that were continuations of new learning, and it introduced them to protocols that we modeled in training days and then encouraged them to bring back to their school and use as they facilitated professional development. We really tried to do the idea of an I do, we do, you do model as we moved through our progress. Our coaches really developed quite a strong sense of community. They asked to have a social media private group. And now that our project's looking to end this summer, they plan on continuing without us and still having meetings and even hoping post-COVID to go visit each other's schools. Our cohort's been really consistent in our data collection and analysis at both cohort and school levels. Database decision-making informed every decision we made as a project team. But again, we were really explicit in modeling that practice to our school teams so that they can then do the same for their school communities. Just as districts can examine measures across schools at a district level, we grouped our cohort schools to evaluate and monitor our project outcomes. Here you'll see the cohort level results of the tiered fidelity inventory. The TFI measures implementation fidelity, and you can see that across the cohort, we started at 26% of Tier 1 behavior support in place, and by the end of last spring, it was up to 81%. Plus, 13 out of 15 of our schools have met the target goal of 70% implementation at Tier 1, and that was after 2 years of support. Here's another tool to help us look at whether or not we're meeting our goals. The self-assessment survey is given to all staff, and they're asked to share their perceptions of whether implementation features are in place, partially in place, or not yet. And across the cohort, you can see that the dark blue is that we moved from 22% being perceived in place to 54% being in place, and the gray being the not yet continued to decrease. But implementation efforts are only valuable if student outcomes are being positively impacted as well. After the first year of the project, all of our schools began using SWIS to track student behavior data. And in SWIS, we look at the number of office disciplinary referrals received by a student. When implemented with fidelity, schools typically find that about 80% of their student population is successful with universal Tier 1 behavior support. And here you can see, looking across the schools in green, that many of our schools were pretty close to having students only receiving 0 to 1 behavior referrals, so hitting that 80%. And as a cohort, we were also close. We still have work to do at both an individual school level and a cohort level, but true implementation typically takes 3 to 5 years anyway before we really fully achieve our desired outcomes. Participant perspectives. We took a lot of data to find out what was working for our participants. And generally, it indicated a strong agreement that our cohort model has been effective for implementation and building capacity, improving outcomes, and that they would recommend it for other schools and districts. Alignment with other initiatives within the school and district were areas we noted participants rated less strongly, and our team is still working through ideas on how to bolster those really important critical features. As we come to the end of this particular project and we reflect upon what we've learned and plan to take forward with our continued work in other rural areas, we've identified a few big takeaways. First, establish clear, transparent expectations from day one. Second, foster, encourage, promote relationships in community building. Third, maintain a gradual release of responsibility with accountability measures built in, basically work yourself out of a job. And fourth, provide frequent communication so that you have an ongoing cadence for the work. This project has made a significant impact, not only on the school experiences of over 4,000 students, but also for the adults in those schools, the families of the students, and the communities that surround them. We are so proud of the great work that has been done, and we're seeking ways to replicate the model to support scaling up PBIS throughout our state, especially in our more rural and remote areas. Now I'll pass it over to Janet, who's going to talk further about her example.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a moment to get set up. All right. Thank you, Karen, for sharing that. That was a really fantastic example of a very large scale project. Super work that you're doing there in Maine. We're going to travel down the East Coast just a bit to Pennsylvania, which is where I am. I'm Janet Van Loan, and I am an assistant professor of education in Pennsylvania, and the rural part of Pennsylvania, right here in the center of the state. I work, as I said, at Bucknell University, and we are working with several school districts in several different capacities. And the project that I'm going to share with you really had to do with both a research study and just developing a project with school districts to support specifically their early career teachers in implementation of class-wide PBIS practices. So a much smaller scale, but I think still really useful for individual early career classroom teachers. So why focus on early career teachers? This really has to do with the current state of the teaching profession and the fact that we have significant teacher shortages all over the country, including in rural areas, especially school districts that are serving already marginalized communities, low-income areas with higher populations of students living in poverty. And when we have high attrition rates of teachers, and there's just kind of this incoming and outgoing group of teachers in buildings, it really impacts the consistency, the morale of the teaching staff, and of course, student learning. So we know that according to research, 44% of new teachers leave before they get to their 5th year of teaching. And this is costly for school districts financially, and it's costly in terms of student learning. So really important to try to focus on early career teachers and help them to stay in classrooms. Another reason to focus on early career teachers is because when we're thinking about pre-service, the work that teachers are doing leading up to getting a teacher certification, and then those first years of teaching, the classroom environments can look quite different, and new teachers need to generalize what they've learned, both in their coursework, in a teacher preparation program, and through their student teaching placement, to sometimes a completely different classroom setting that doesn't look like what their student teaching placement looked like. And generalizing their practice can be quite challenging and requires ongoing support. So that's another reason to really focus on early career teachers. If you have spent time in a classroom like I have, as I can remember back to my first years of teaching, being quite challenging and trying to get my feet on the ground, it does take a few years. So when we're thinking about teaching quality, we need to be thinking about helping our teachers develop skills early on and keep them in classrooms as a way to address the teacher shortage. This is really important right now, I think, because of COVID. We don't quite know how COVID will affect the teacher shortage, but it's looking, when you look at preliminary data on this, it's not looking good. We have had a lot of early retirements, so that's going to leave a lot of open positions in rural school districts. And then we've had a lot of teachers leave because of the pandemic. So this is going to be another problem. And if we couple that with the fact that new teachers, teachers in pre-service programs right now, so those seeking certification, their programs have also been affected by COVID. So last year's teachers who were doing student teaching during the spring semester, their student teaching was cut in half. And they entered classrooms that looked a lot different from anything that they had experienced, with a lot less experience, because the student teaching semester is really an integral component of adequate preparation. And that is going to continue with this group of graduates this year, and probably even the next year, because we know that for college students in teacher preparation programs, they're out in field placements getting practice opportunities early on. So this is something that we're going to need to think about at least for the next couple of years. And COVID is just a contributor to this problem. So the research suggests when we think about early career teachers that we focus on providing high quality mentoring and induction to beginning teachers, and that we want to include components of observation and feedback is critical to development. So these things happen traditionally in student teaching, but without a formal induction program or mentor protege program, things can really fall apart in the early career if this doesn't continue to happen. And because of a lot of budget cuts and a lack of resources, a lot of school districts have cut induction programming, which can be hurtful to early career teachers. Research also suggests that we focus on classroom management practices, evidence-based classroom management practices within the class-wide Pbis system that are really prevention-focused and proactive and positive. So one of the things that I like to talk about when I'm working with my student teachers and early career teachers in local districts here is helping them to think about class-wide Pbis, positive preventative classroom management practices as a foundation. And this is important in the early career because I know that the folks that I work with are so excited to get into classrooms. They're really, really creative. They love their students. They just can't wait to get out there and teach and read stories and all these other great parts of teaching that they always love and enjoy. But I like to share a story of something that happened a few years ago when I lived in Connecticut, a story that was on the news about homes, really beautiful homes in Connecticut that had been built in the 80s. And the builder used a faulty cement mixture in the foundation. So come the 2000s, around 2015 or so, these homes that where this cement mixture was used the foundations were beginning to crumble, and the beautiful homes were falling into the ground. So that's kind of my rationale for wanting to use positive classroom management practices. Classroom management can be that foundation for everything else that you want to build, all the really great, fun, interactive, engaging things that you want to do with your students in your classroom. If you have that really strong foundation where you've created an environment in your classroom that is nurturing, that is positive, where all students feel included, and where you have a system for where you've developed routines and where you have a system for recognizing good behavior and what you want to see from your students and addressing issues in your classroom, then you have a strong foundation which you can build from. So that is why this is so important for our early career, highly motivated, really creative teachers. When we think about rural schools and professional development in rural schools, Karen already mentioned the problematic kind of train and hope, one-shot professional development trainings, which really have been shown to be quite ineffective. And instead, what we can do is combine several components to help early career teachers develop habits early on. And if you think about developing habits, it's much, much easier to create a habit than it is to break a habit. Anybody who has ever tried to change a habit knows that it can be really hard. So if we focus on early career and developing good classroom, class-wide Pbis practices related to classroom management early on, then we won't have to address things later on, and we will hopefully keep teachers in classrooms. So these components can really help to do that: peer coaching, video analysis, and guided reflection. And the most important thing I think for rural schools is that these components are all effective and they are efficient, and and accessible. So for rural schools that may be in remote areas, you may not have access to local experts that want to come in and work with your teachers. These can be put together. You can find all of these things within your school setting already, and I'll show you how. And anybody really can do it, and it's free, which is, I think, really helpful too. So if you are lacking resources, you can put these things together, and you won't have to spend money on them. So that's very important too. Before I show you the tool that I've used in our local schools to do this, I'll just mention that all of these components are grounded in research. There has been research showing that video analysis and peer coaching is an effective strategy. This research has taken place both in service, so practicing teachers in classrooms, and with pre-service teachers. So this is what our tool looks like that we use with our early career teachers. And the way that I implement this is to initially meet with the teachers, and I do a few things. I teach them all of the practices, and I'm going to show you this blown up a little bit. I know it's really small right here, but I teach them the big five, the evidence-based classroom management practices that are listed at the top. And I do that explicitly by explaining what each one is and providing a lot of examples and non-examples of what they look like. I use a lot of video models when I teach these practices to help make sure that everybody understands and ask questions about them. We think about what they would look like in our teachers' specific classrooms and talk through it and make sure that everybody understands. And then I explicitly teach how to use the tool. So first teach what the practices are that we're working on and improving. And then we teach how to go through this process of using video analysis and peer coaching and guided reflection with this classroom practices video analysis tool. So what teachers do is they pair up with a peer. It can be another early career teacher, or perhaps a PBIS coach, school district, or within the school, or a teacher expert who's been identified as someone who would be good to do this. And they watch 15 minutes of their pre-recorded teaching. It's best to use direct instruction, or as much as possible. And as they're watching, they just collect data on their own use of these skills. On the flip side of this, all of these are defined, which I will define for you in a slide coming up. So they collect data on their use of prompts and pre-corrections, their use of specific feedback to their students, including specific praise and calm and quick error corrections, their use of varied opportunities to respond, and relational contact. And following the data collection, the peers have a conversation using these questions to guide the conversation. And I'll show you what that looks like in these next slides. So the first step, as I said, is to review the big five: maximizing structure in your classroom, posting, teaching, reviewing, monitoring, and reinforcing a small number of positively stated expectations, active engagement for students, establishing a continuum of strategies to acknowledge appropriate behavior, and establishing a continuum of strategies to respond to inappropriate behavior. So following instruction, when the peers are sitting down to do this, they review all of these. So as they're meeting over the weeks, again and again, they're reviewing that these are research-based practices for positive prevention-focused classroom management practices. The second step, as I said, is to collect data as they watch 15 minutes. So they're just putting tally marks every time they see themselves prompt, which is simply a reminder to students about a behavioral expectation that has been previously taught. So let's say that during direct instruction, your expectation is that students raise their hand. You would just remind them of that before you have any problem to prompt for that behavior to happen. Feedback can be positive and specific. Thank you for raising your hand. And if there's an issue, just a really calm, quick error correction or redirection in some way. and how teachers provide opportunities to respond. So this can be a one-to-one opportunity to respond, like the teacher says something and calls on one student to respond, which has engaged one student, or when you're engaging more than one student, like a turn and talk, or having students agree or disagree with a thumbs up or thumbs down. So they collect data on all of those things and then use the guided reflection to review the big five, go through those questions, analyze their data. And then finally, I think the really important piece is to target areas for improvement and discuss strategies for building habits. One of the reasons the peer coaching model works really well is that it's not an evaluation, it's not an administrator. So this can really be an opportunity for an early career teacher to sort of set their own goals based on what they're looking at, based on watching themselves on video and being able to see their classroom, how the students are interacting, how they're interacting with their students from that bird's eye view that they may not see while they're teaching. And then they can use that experience to really target areas for improvement. And I think that it's really powerful for early career teachers to really be able to look at themselves and set their own goals according to what they see in the classroom and the data that they collect. It just can be really powerful. So again, just to review the process, it's explicit instruction. This can be with a school-based expert or through a webinar, using examples and non-examples for each of the teaching behaviors and modeling, and then ongoing use of the tool with a peer coach. And you can phase this out over time. So if teachers begin by doing it once a week with a peer, setting up video analysis sessions and setting goals, and then over time, maybe going to every other week or once a month, depending on how things are going, it can really be individualized. So the next step for our own project with the districts that we're working with in our local area is to pick up where we left off. We cut things off because of COVID, but we're going to try to expand beyond this pilot that we started right before COVID that worked very well. And we got a lot of really good feedback from the teachers that were involved. So with that, I'm going to pass this along to Laura.
So just to wrap up, we wanted to just go over a couple of things from lessons learned across this past couple of years where we're really looking at rural. We had talked about those common strengths and barriers with that strong sense of community, the strong relationships, supportive administrators, and easier to coordinate. But then we also talked about those barriers of funding, time, lack of resources, misunderstanding of PBIS, and competing priorities. And those are something to think about, how to build those strengths and then also adjust to those barriers. However, we also want you to realize that when we think about adapting PBIS implementation, it's not just a list of strategies, but it's also a consideration of the context. What does rural mean in your area, whether it's your state, your district, your school? What does that mean? We have these ideas of critical features of PBIS, and I'm going to put them all up quickly because Heather had talked about them. But overall, it's this framework that supports our outcomes, that we look at our data, we make data-based decision-making, we use our practices, and we use the systems to support our really good practices. And we think about equity. But overall, what we really want to think about is that we are thinking about how does this work in our context? How do we look at it culturally for the school, for the system that we are looking at? And that's where we think that PBIS could really help provide that. So overall, when we're thinking about adapting our rural implementation, how do we make our practices contextually appropriate? How do we make our systems contextually appropriate and our data? and how do we address equity throughout? If you can kind of think of that framework and think of those practices, systems, data, and equitable outcomes as the driving force of how to adjust PBIS for your setting, that goes a long way. PBIS provides a framework to help make that successful, whether it's rural, urban, et cetera. It's that context and that framework that helps support that. And finally, just an example to wrap it up of a really good example of a school that looked at what was happening and seeing that it wasn't totally working. They had rolled out Tier 1 PBIS, but when they went and asked the students, what are our expectations? What are our behaviors across the school? The students were not able to name them. And this was a school that was worked with a Navajo population. And what they realized was that they had to go back to the team to talk to the families and the community and to think about what matters for our school, our culture, our context. They decided to incorporate some of the Navajo language and values into the PBIS. They revised their practices, their lesson plans to include biographies of historical and contemporary cultural figures that were important for that culture and brought in that storytelling that was important for that Navajo students. Then they encouraged students self-reflection based on those behaviors of what was important. And if you want to think about that, that's a way to collect that data that might be really important for that local community. So overall here, we have this cultural adaptation in a rural setting. We have a change of the systems, thinking about how do we incorporate that important values of the community? How can we change our practices and our expectations to reflect that? And then how do we look at data? If you look at the self-reflection, that could be a source of data. In the beginning, they didn't know the expected behaviors. At the end, if you share that self-reflection, you're going to see whether or not they understand those behaviors of the PBIS. So just an example, so something to consider on how to make PBIS work for your area. We have questions, and if anybody has any that are have been posted, I know we're short on time. We just wanted to also share some resources from the Center on PBIS that we've been developing for rural settings, addressing barriers and strengths in rural settings. We have a remote instruction strategy matrix for rural settings, building momentum in high needs districts, which often include rural settings. And right now we're working on a remote instruction strategy matrix for collaboration for families, parents, and guardians. With that, I'm going to see if there are any questions that have come across while I've been chatting.
I think everything's been addressed through chat, unless there's anything left.
If not, we'd like to invite you to have further conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions on any of the materials. If you have additional needs that or strengths that we haven't addressed that you would like us to think about for the center, we would love to hear from you and work on more collaboration in this setting. We really think that PBIS can provide that framework that will help address those needs, but also build upon the strengths that the rural communities have. And we really thank you all for joining us today.